nakilala na po natin ang Communication Foundation for Asia, ang ating Executive Director, Ma'am Pai. So ngayon po ay hindi na po natin patatagalin ang ating first topic sa ating webinar series. So let us welcome to lecture on developing the content and pedagogical knowledge of teachers in the L1 and L2, our Senior Literacy and Education Consultant ng Summer Institute of Linguistics Asia, Dr. Dianne Dekker.
Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Thank you so much for inviting me to share with you. I think it's a privilege to be talking with you in Sarangani. Who would have thought just a few months ago that we would have this opportunity to engage this way? And it's good to see so many familiar faces. I'm happy to be here and share a few things, and then we can have a discussion towards the end about some of the things. And if you want to interrupt and ask a question, please just direct your question to Evan, and she can be the one to interrupt me and tell me what we need to clarify or what needs to be discussed together. I will share my screen now. See if it works. Oops, hold on 1 second. Oops, I have to change my, there we go. Okay, so yes, thank you. I'm going to just talk a little bit about developing teachers' content knowledge, pedagogy, and pedagogical knowledge in the L1, the L2. The L2, I can use to refer to any second languages. So it could be Tagalog, it could be Cebuano, it could be English, it could be any other second language. And then we'll talk a little bit about transitioning to the L2 and a little bit about code switching back and forth to the L1. So let's just see what this conversation is about. I'm going to share some big ideas, which will sort of be the framework around which we will attach some more specific content. So the big ideas revolve around content knowledge, pedagogy and pedagogical content knowledge, and then also principles of multilingual education, more particularly mother tongue-based multilingual education. And then I'll get to some specific ideas around how to implement multilingual education, and then I'll open it up to comments and questions from you. So I just want you to take a minute and think about those terms: content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge. What do they mean to you? What do you think of as you think of those terms? Perhaps they're familiar terms, perhaps they're new terms. So when we're talking about content knowledge, we're talking about what we know about the subject that we're teaching. So when we're teaching math, it's how much do we know about math or science or even English or Tagalog. It's the knowledge that we have of the subject matter that we're meant to be teaching. And then, of course, when we're talking about pedagogical knowledge, we're talking about knowing how to teach and how learners learn, knowing how to manage a classroom so that everybody can participate in the learning process, and that learning is progressing at a reasonable pace, and that the students, the learners, are participating in the learning well. And then when we talk about pedagogical content knowledge, we're talking about that special ability of teachers in terms of knowing how to teach the content that they're focusing on. So how do we teach math concepts? How do we teach science concepts? And things like that. So those are the differences of those three terms, and we want to understand how those interact with each other and how the teacher builds that knowledge, him or herself. So I want to remind us of something that I'm sure we all know, and that is that we have to know what we're teaching. We have to know how to teach what we're meant to teach. We have to know how our learners learn. And so this means that we have to make sure that our knowledge, our content knowledge, is up to date. We can't just rely on what we learned in the past, but we always have to follow what's going on now. What are people learning now? Sometimes teachers are quite tied to the textbook. The textbook is there for a resource to help the teachers, that's true. But the teacher needs to know, how do I make this information within the textbook usable by my learners? How do my learners understand this, and how do they use it in their everyday lives? And so we need to continue to grow in our understanding of those three terms: the content knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, and pedagogical content knowledge. And when we need to pay attention to continuing, ongoing, lifelong professional development ourselves. And sometimes that's easiest done when we are collaborating with our colleagues, our teachers, our school head, because sometimes it may not be very easy to go outside to a seminar where we update our information, but you can always look on the internet and learn from the internet, learn from each other, learn together with your teachers, and make sure that you're always upgrading your own knowledge, your own content knowledge, and pedagogical content knowledge, so that you are able to continue to grow. So teachers, I have found, want to continually grow in their profession. Most teachers, there are very, very, very few Filipino teachers, I haven't really met any, who really don't care about growing in their profession. They want to do a good job. They love their students. They want to help their students. They know that they're building a nation, so to speak. And so they're seeking ongoing professional development. So we want to focus on in-service training. We want to focus on teacher training at the college level. We want to focus on also helping the teacher educators at the college level. Think about all of the ways that teachers are trained and that they access new training. We want to focus on strengthening those, so that each course, each conversation, each discussion is always improving and growing, and there's learning going on among the teachers as well. So we also want to encourage teachers to do some research themselves. Try things out in your classroom. Find out what works better, and then go and talk about that with your colleagues and listen to what they tried out and what they found works well, and then just capitalize on those activities and those pedagogies that work very well in your classrooms. When you are doing ongoing professional development and collaboration, I don't think it's important to do that in the dominant languages or even in English. I think it's important to do that conversation and that learning together in the L1. Don't just talk about the L1 and how you're teaching it. Use the L1 in your coursework, whether you're at college or taking an MA course, or whether you're sitting with your colleagues. I know that when you sit with your colleagues, you're going to probably talk in the L1, but you need to develop your L1 so that you're using academic terms in the L1, or that you're thinking about how do we say this in the L1 together, rather than just talking about the teaching in the classroom through the L1. Do it yourselves. It will facilitate your own development of your L1. And then I encourage every teacher not only to collaborate, but to do two things as well: to find a mentor, find someone who has more experience or more knowledge. They don't have to be older. Sometimes a younger teacher will have more knowledge because she or he just graduated and they have fresh knowledge. Find someone else who has more experience. Perhaps an older teacher has more experience than you in classroom management. Find a mentor, whether it's an official mentoring relationship or whether it's a sort of a mentoring relationship where you watch them and you learn from them, so that you are growing as you understand what good teachers do in the classroom. And you can ask questions of your mentor. The other thing too is find a mentee, someone you can mentor. someone that you can come alongside of and walk through and help them and support them and give them ideas in how to do their teaching and how to manage their classroom and things like that. So never give up on having a mentor or being a mentor. That should be part of your lifelong ongoing learning and professional development. Another thing that's really helpful for teachers is if they can find ways to attend courses, to attend conferences, to attend symposiums. Even participating in this webinar is a great example of how you have chosen yourselves to focus on your ongoing learning. You've said, well, I wonder what these 3 speakers are going to say. I wonder if there will be anything new there. But you've come along to find out so that you can learn and determine is how can I use this? How can I apply these things that we're learning? And then you yourself sharing in those kinds of atmospheres, in a conference, give a paper in a conference, share your experiences at a symposium, or even within your school. Maybe you can have days where every once in a while, once a month or once a quarter, the teachers all get together and share what they're learning on different topics so that everybody is growing together. Try new things in your classroom. Innovative practices help us learn and grow. You might learn that something's not very helpful, but that's okay. That's part of learning. We want to find those new things and then create new ideas. Learn how to do things differently. It's very easy for teachers to continue to practice what they know well and to repeat what they know well because it's very comfortable. You know it works. You've done it so many times that it's very easy to do that. What's challenging for teachers is to try new things, to create new ideas. But that's where teachers grow and also where their learners grow as well, because they also enjoy learning through new methods too. So take just a minute and reflect on your own educational practice, your own educational experience. Think about how you learned when you were in school. Think about how you learned when you were in college, how you were taught to teach. Just think about that, because when we reflect on that, we can analyze that, and that helps us learn beyond what we're used to, beyond our comfort zone, beyond what we know and can do very readily. Think about how you can take courses that focus on pedagogical content knowledge. Maybe you can ask your supervisor or your school head to request the university to offer a course on pedagogical content knowledge, because you know that you and your colleagues would love to learn more about that. And that would help you learn how to teach your subjects better, how to improve your teaching, how to bring in new activities and new practices that will benefit your students. Think about your own experiences in teaching and learn from those and share those with others. Some of them went very well and some of them were not very good. That's okay. We learn from all of those. So just reflecting on your own experiences helps you remember, I want to not do that again unless I can adjust it so that it works. Or I definitely want to try this one again because it was such a positive experience. And then, of course, collaborating with colleagues in a supportive environment. I can't stress that enough. Sometimes collaboration happens, but there might be somebody in there that's not very supportive and not very enthusiastic about being there. When you're in a collaborative environment, everybody needs to be supportive. Green light. When we say green lighting, we mean you're brainstorming. No idea is a bad idea. You just throw ideas out and then you sift through the ideas. You categorize them and find out, well, maybe that wouldn't work very well, but this one might work well. But make sure it's a supportive environment. And then, of course, make sure you know your subject well. We have to continue to grow in our subject areas because we can't teach what we learned in school. That's already old, right? They have this saying in the West, too, that before a book is even published, it's already outdated because new information already exists. So don't rely on what you learned in school. Keep learning about your subject matter that you're teaching too. there was a gentleman named Lordy way back in the 60s who termed this phrase, apprenticeship of observation. And he said basically that teachers are very, very influenced by the number of years that they sat as learners. So we were learners in a classroom from KG to grade 12, and then 4 more years of college. So that's about 17 years of schooling where we were observing model teachers teaching us. That's where we got most of our knowledge about how to teach. Even for teachers who sit in classes where they're specifically teaching you new modern methods, new pedagogies, it's still far easier for all of us to resort to the way we were taught. And it's challenging to get beyond that. But unless we reflect on our practices and what we're doing, we will not ever get beyond teaching the way we were taught. And we want to move beyond that. I want to also emphasize the importance of developing your first language for academic teaching. You use your first language every single day, right? But mostly you use it for socializing or just conversation, everyday conversation. You don't really use it to talk about photosynthesis or to talk about beakers in your science class or to talk about nouns and pronouns or to talk about multiplication and things like that. Those are all school vocabularies. So I want you to try to think about developing your L1 so that you can bridge it and you can use it for teaching academic subjects. Learn what your students already know and then build on that using the L1. And when you're teaching, whether it's oral teaching or you're using written form of L1 in your classroom, make sure that you're following an appropriate community accepted orthography and that you're writing accurately. You might be used to writing in Tagalog or Cebuano or English and not so used to writing in your L1. Maybe you just use that for writing letters or something like that, but not for writing lesson plans and stories for children to read. So make sure you're using the right orthography that the community appreciates and accepts, and make sure you're writing accurately. Oftentimes, because when you went to school, you studied English grammar, and that's often how you learned English too. But when you studied English grammar, that's quite different from the grammar of Philippine languages. And a lot of times teachers are really tempted to just, if this is their L1 or Philippine-based languages, they overlay the grammar of English and expect that to describe the language of the Philippines, their L1 or Tagalog or the lingua franca of the area. But the grammars are very, very different. So make sure you understand how your first language works, and then teach your students those things explicitly. Then you know intuitively this sentence in L1 is correct, this one is not correct. And if you think about it, you can probably identify why one is correct and why one is not correct. But because you have never studied formally your L1, it will be too easy for you to just overlay English terms, predicate and subject and pronoun and verbs and all of those things. But you have to dig in and find someone to help you. I know somebody in this seminar who is an excellent person to guide you on Philippine language grammars. You can just ask Dr. Nolasco. Either he or someone he knows will be able to help you. Then also think about the academic vocabulary in all of your languages. What academic vocabulary do you use in Tagalog? What are the terms in Cebuano? What are the terms in the L1, if there are any? And don't worry if there aren't any. No matter what language you introduce your content in using academic terms, you're still going to have to explain that. A lot of teachers will say, I can't use the L1 when I'm talking about academics because there are no words for it. So I prefer to teach it in English because that's where the vocabulary is. But even when you introduce the concept of division, you still have to identify and explain what that word division means. So whether you use the English term or another term that's more closely related to the local languages, you still have to explain that. So don't shy away from using the L1 because of the academic terms that exist differently in different languages. Just learn those and use whatever is easiest for you to use. So I encourage you to think about your own content knowledge and to plan and take steps to improve it, to increase it. Initiate your own professional development. Don't wait for DepEd to offer you an in-service, because you might wait a long time. There's a lot of teachers in the Philippines, and you might be waiting for a decade or so before you have opportunity to go to an in-service. So don't wait for that. You're a professional. You're a professional teacher. So take it upon yourself as a professional to look at your own professional development and do what you can. And always collaborate with other teachers so that you're learning together in a group rather than just independently. Your learning will expand when you do it together with other teachers. Also, as you're thinking about your own pedagogy and your own pedagogical content knowledge, pay attention to what works for your students. And you know, as teachers, that every year you have a different set of students and things change, right? This set of students had certain activities that worked well for them, but the last 2 years, it wouldn't have worked for those students. So pay attention to your students and make sure you're addressing and teaching them through pedagogies that work for them. And you can use your teachers, your teacher collaboration group to explore and to grow and to collaborate and to learn more about what works best in your classroom. So now I want to move beyond the content knowledge, the pedagogical knowledge, and the pedagogical content knowledge concepts, and just focus a little bit on mother tongue-based multilingual education. A lot of teachers will say, I know this using the mother tongue is better. I know my students understand better, but I don't really know how to do it. I haven't ever experienced it myself, and I haven't ever seen other people demonstrate it too. So let's think about some big picture ideas. And I see some chats going on in the background, but because I'm sharing my screen, I'm not able to access those. So if you need me to hurry up or something, somebody needs to come on and say, go a little bit faster. Okay, so big picture ideas. Number one, explore your own ideologies related to MTB-MLE. Do you believe that is a good thing, or are you not sure whether it's a good thing or not? Or are you convinced that it's not a good thing for the country, that you're going to lose the edge that the Philippines already has on their English proficiency? Whatever your questions are, find someone that you trust who understands MTB-MLE and supports it, and ask them your questions transparently. Be honest. Let them respond to you so that you have sound answers and you know what the answers are and you can explain them to someone else. It's not wrong to question the policy or the why, but it is wrong not to find out why people have put this policy in place and to just hold on to your own ideas. It's better to understand, to explore, to ask questions. Number two, develop your own L1 for vocabulary, for academic language, for social language. You're going to be teaching the L1 for listening, speaking, reading, and writing. You're going to teach the orthography of your L1. You have to teach the grammar for your L1 and the writing protocol for your L1 to your students. So you better know what those things are. You better feel very comfortable, and you might have to give some specific time to learning yourself some of those things if you're not already there. And teachers who are not there yet are just not there because of their own educational experience in other languages. Then also take some time to think about what you know, the content of your subject that you know in English. You're comfortable speaking it in English. Try to think about how you can make that clear and simple for your students in using the L1. And let them help you. I once met a teacher who said, you know, at the beginning, I was really embarrassed because I didn't have the L1 terms. And I would be stumbling around in a lesson trying to remember the L1 terms, and my students would offer those L1 terms. She said, at first I was embarrassed because I thought I'm supposed to know this and teach my students, but they're teaching me. But she was able to relax and say, we're learning together. So let your students help you learn as well. And then it's really important in the classroom to incorporate activities in the learning so that the students are engaged in the topic and discovering their own learning, not just listening to a whole bunch of words. So I'm going to tell you, make sure that for however old your students are, if they're 5 years old, they can only pay attention for 5 minutes. Then you have to do something different, have another activity. 5 minutes, have another activity. If they're 7, they can pay attention for 7 minutes. However many years old they are, that's about how many minutes they can pay attention. So change your activities up. You guys are all over 20, so I'm hoping you can pay attention to all of my words for more than 20 minutes. Okay, learning always starts with what we already know. If it's going to impact our lives, if we're going to take the learning away and use it, then we always have to start with what we know. Ozubel, way back in the 60s, said that the single most important factor influencing learning is what the learners already know. If you start with what the learners already know and teach them accordingly, they will learn. So I have 2 pictures here on the screen. You might guess where they are from. Does anybody know? Those are from Kalinga. So this is what Kalinga students know. This is part of what they know. If you show them a picture of somebody in Paris standing next to Eiffel Tower, they might want to learn about that, but they don't know it yet. So we would never start with the Eiffel Tower in Paris. We would start with what they know and then link that to what we want them to learn from the curriculum. It's the most important learning. Ladson Billings she said the same thing in different ways, talking about culturally responsive pedagogy. Teaching in response to the local culture, to what the children know, to what their daily lives look like, to what their community knowledge is, how the children grow up and learn. What the teacher has to know and appreciate the local culture of the learners and the values and the cultural norms of the learners' community. So if you're teaching in a place where you have not grown up, then you need to learn about the local culture. You need to understand what the values are and the norms are so that you can frame every lesson from the perspective of the local community. She also talked about cultural competence, and that's knowing the differences between various cultures. So the teacher needs to know the difference between their own personal culture or community culture and the learner's culture. For example, if you are teaching in Bukidnon, but you're from Sarangani, you've got to understand Sarangani culture, you've got to understand Bukidnon culture so that you can focus on teaching from a Bukidnon perspective to your learners. And you have to understand the difference between the dominant or national culture and your own culture and the local cultures, and also the international culture and the local cultures, so that you can make a choice to value each one, each culture, because each culture brings different knowledge and different perspectives. And we want to value all of them, not just valuing the dominant culture. So this picture here is another picture from Kalinga, but it represents what is culturally near for these girls. If you know, can you tell what they're pounding there? Can you tell by what's in the bowl and what's in the winnower? They're pounding coffee. So they grow coffee in Kalinga. They're very familiar with coffee trees and the process of processing the bean all the way until they have a cup of coffee in front of them. But in Manila, You are going to have kids who are familiar with the little package of Nescafe that they might get at the Sari Sari store, or the package of coffee that's on the shelf in the grocery store. They're not going to be familiar with this. So you need to frame all of your lessons starting with what's familiar and leading them to what you want them to learn. This diagram helps us to understand that a lot. So in the classroom, we have two knowns and unknowns, and we're going to talk about them in terms of concept and language. So when we are in this quadrant of this box, we are accessing these four blue boxes are where the teachers are teaching. This is the teacher's focus. And in the first box, we're accessing prior knowledge. We have known and known. We have both known concepts. So that would be the processing of coffee beans in Kalinga. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to introduce our lesson by talking about that in the local language, the L1. That's accessing prior knowledge. Every lesson should access prior knowledge before you get into the lesson. Remember in the old days when the first thing you did in every lesson was you talked about the vocabulary, the key words of the lesson so that they would be familiar with those? Think now, instead of doing that, you're going to access the prior knowledge of the learner to introduce the subject that you want them to learn. So this is where you start your lesson. If you're teaching language, if you're focusing on Tagalog or English, then you want to use known concepts so that they're starting with a concept that they know and they're just applying the language to talk about what they already know. They're learning how to talk about known concepts in Tagalog or in English. If you're teaching concepts, like a new concept in science or math or history, you want to use a known language for academic learning. So they're learning unknown concepts using their first language, a known language. You want to avoid this box where there are two unknowns. There is an unknown concept and there is an unknown language. Som konyo yan aket, sisin egyo, hajiun ko on yulu, mansusuyo kayo. Diba? If you think about it, this is where the teaching existed in the old days. Unknown concepts were taught in unknown languages. Tagalog and English were the medium of instruction, and all the concepts were unknown. And teachers may or may not have accessed prior knowledge to get there, but this is what we want to avoid. We want children to either focus on learning new concepts with their known language or learning a new language, using it to talk about known concepts. So that there's only one unknown and there's always one known. Okay. So good multilingual education teaching builds on what children already know. It doesn't ignore it. It doesn't teach in isolation of what children already know. And it focuses on meaningful interaction and comprehension and conversation. If you look at this picture, do you see a typical classroom in this picture? I love this picture. Why do I love it? When you look at it, what do you see? Almost every student in this picture is standing on their seat and they are raising their hand because they understand what the teacher has said for the first time in their lives, perhaps, and they have a response and they can't wait to give the response to the teacher. A traditional, typical classroom is where all the children are sitting in their seats and they are afraid that the teacher is going to call on them, that they're not going to understand what the teacher has said, and that they're not going to have a response. But when learning and teaching focuses on meaningful interaction, comprehension, and conversation between the teacher and the students, then learning goes on and students are not afraid. They're not fearful of what the teacher is saying that they don't understand. They're not fearful to try and give an answer. They're excited to give an answer. They can't wait to be called on. And good multilingual education focuses also on the learners. The learners are more important than the curriculum or the teacher's plan. You want to teach what the learners are ready to learn. Yes, there is a curriculum guide, and you need to follow that curriculum guide as much as you can. But when that curriculum guide goes too fast and your learners can't keep up, or when your learners need to process something a little bit more, take the time and do that. Focus on the learners, not as much on the curriculum or on yourself, on what you're saying. And also, good multilingual education focuses on language development, developing first the first language, and then also developing Tagalog, and also developing English. All three languages are important. Some people misunderstand MLE by assuming that it's just L1 education and that we're not paying attention to the other languages, but that's very, very far from the truth. All three languages are important, but we're just putting them in an order that makes it easier for children to learn them and to learn them well. Another very important point, this last bullet point, literacy, learning how to read, has to flow out of already comprehensible oral language proficiency. So children have to understand what they hear and be able to respond, so that when they're reading those words, they're familiar with those words because they use them in their everyday language. If they're reading words that they haven't learned to use yet in conversation, they might learn to decode them, but they're not going to be able to comprehend them. And that's what happened when children were learning to decode before they could speak the language. We want to just put them in order to make it easier for children to gain comprehension of what they're reading and writing. Okay, let's just focus on what is the intent of multilingual education, or of mother tongue based multilingual education. What do we want? We want learners to use everyday language that is called BICS, basic interpersonal communicative skills, in their L1, their L2, and their L3. So we want them to be able to talk, to understand what they hear, and to use that language for everyday conversation in all three of their languages. We want them to also be able to talk about subject matter, academic content, academic language in all three of their languages, L1, L2, and L3. That is called cognitive academic language proficiency. So there's two distinctions between BICS and CALP. BICS is how we talk informally. CALP is the language that we use in school, which is quite a different language. And we want children to be proficient in both of those and in all three of their languages. We want them to be able to listen, speak, read, and write for meaningfully, and also correctly. We want meaning and accuracy to be key components in all three of their languages. Okay, I think you get that idea. So in the old days, we focused more on accuracy. We corrected every grammatical error that they made in English to help them produce correct English. We corrected everything that they said in any language, and even the content they said, because we wanted it to be accurate. We wanted them to know what they were meant to know, whether they understood it or not. We always thought that maybe later the meaning will catch up. They will understand it later, but they need to get it correct now, because if we don't get it correct now, they're never going to get it correct. They will repeat their mistakes over and over. But we want to focus on meaning so that they understand the components of language as well as the content. And then we also want to make sure that they get it correct. But meaning is first, and correctness comes after that in the case of MLE. So we want to just talk for a minute about the phases of a strong three-language curriculum for multilingual education programs. This was created by Dr. Susan Malone. And what she said was, we always begin in KG and carry on all the way through college. We don't ever stop developing oral L1. A 5-year-old who starts school is fluent for a 5-year-old in their L1. But they're not as fluent as their parents and their grandparents. They need to continue to develop that oral L1. and for academics in school too. So we always want to give focus to developing the oral L1. We will never stop, so we'll continue developing oral L1, and then we will begin teaching them how to read and write in the L1. That way, when they read those words in the L1, they're familiar words that they use orally, and so they can comprehend the text immediately. It doesn't go before. Sorry, I just want to emphasize this. In the past, we taught literacy, we taught reading before the oral proficiency was there. And that's why children went for so long being able to decode text, but not understanding what they were reading. And too many times, children were thought to be slow learners. They weren't slow learners. They just didn't have the oral capacity to help them understand the written word. So we want to put it in the right order so that they can learn well and easily. We continue oral and written L1 development, and then we begin developing oral L2, focusing on listening and speaking. Remember in the old days, you taught reading in the L2 in order to produce listening and speaking in the L2. We want to turn that around and start with oral before we go into literacy in the L2. Then we'll continue oral and written L1 and L2, and we can begin teaching literacy in the L2. And then we can also begin preparing students to understand what they hear in the L3 and to respond well in the L3 too, and appropriately. We continue all of these developments, and then we add literacy in the L3, and then all three are continued to be developed. And I want to make a statement. This sort of ladder plan is not by grade level. You don't just do developing oral L1 and KG and then introducing the next in grade 1 and then the next in grade 2. It's not a grade level. These can all happen within a couple of grades. It's just the way you plan how you're going to teach the language. So it's not equivalent to grade levels. It's just planning for language development. Okay. A lot of words. So how about this? Are there any comments or questions? Do you want to stop for a moment and take a deep breath, or are you ready? You want to just keep plugging away?
Ma'am Evan? Ma'am Evan?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You might want to prompt the listeners to ask their questions. I think Ma'am Dianne wants some feedback on what has been discussed.
Okay.
Kung naay pangutana, pwede nang i-post karon, no?
Yes. Sige, so for our participants in the Facebook live streaming, nag-comment na po ako doon kanina for you to ask questions and utilize the comment box. Kasi para po ma-address natin directly, baka po mamaya makakalimutan na ninyo at hindi na ma-address ang mga concerns nyo. So for our participants here sa Zoom, you can also raise your hand dito po. Meron po tayong menu dito na you can raise your hand or you can write your question in the comment box as well. So can we give Ma'am Dianne a break first?
Okay. You want to have a glass of water, yes. Dianne?
I'm good. I just want to make sure that people are tracking and they're not.
I have a question, Dianne.
No, sige.
The last point that you made, no, about this graph that you're showing doesn't represent the grade level. Okay, right. So that means, okay, for instance, from kinder to grade 3, okay, this can all happen, no?
Yes.
At a certain stages.
Yes.
For instance, in grade 1, no, you may introduce already oral L2, Okay, but only insofar as the vocabulary and the concepts that the learners already know. Okay, am I correct? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so when we start developing oral L2, we want to focus on helping them to understand what they hear and to speak it. So it's not just a list of vocabulary. We will do some of the same things that we do for L1. We might use a big book. We might read a big book to them on a story that's very familiar to them, but it's written in Tagalog, not in their L1. And then we talk about the words of Tagalog that come out of that story that are related to things that they know. And they build their oral capacity little by little, not by memorizing words, not by the teacher saying, all of these words in Tagalog and the students responding, but by using different pedagogies and methods to build comprehension of the second language and the ability to respond in the second language, not just recitation. So there are lots of things you can do. One thing is TPR, another thing is using big books, another thing is playing games, another thing is developing the concept of the routines in your classroom, where they understand those routines in any language that you're using, whether it's the L1 first, of course, but also the L2, like when it's time to go out to recess. Students, you say in Tagalog, close your books, put your books away, and line up at the door. They can learn those routines in all three of their languages so that they're familiar with what those languages sound like. They're becoming familiar with the words of those languages, and they can respond in action. They can shut their book, they can put it in their desk, they can stand up and get in line, those kinds of things, so that they're responding in action, even if they're not responding in words. So it's not recitation, it's doing different activities to help them to learn the sounds of the second language, to learn to understand what they hear in the second language, and then to respond in the second language. Maybe first through action. The teacher might say in Tagalog, raise your hand, so they know what that means, and they'll raise their hand. Maybe the teacher will say, stand up, sit down, whatever happens. They can respond first in action, and then later they can respond in word as well. And that way they're gradually developing their L2, and to do the same thing with their L3, rather than just repeating after the teacher, say what I say.
Okay.
That sort of thing.
Dianne, the regional director is around. Okay, so can we pause a bit, to hear his message?
Yes, I will stop sharing.
Ma'am Evan.
Yes, Sir Rick.
Okay, we can pause. Then can we hear the regional director? Okay, message.
Right. So, while naka-break po si Miss Dianne, please prepare your question. Let us throw questions kasi this is a rare opportunity na direct po sa mga experts natin yung sagot. So whatever are questions regarding MTBMLE, regarding the development from language 1, language 2, kung paano po yun sa mga nahihirapan natin ng mga teachers, please, while naka-break po tayo ngayon, please write your questions para po ma-address natin lahat.
Meanwhile, we can hear from the regional director, Ma'am Evan.
Alright. So, ngayon, mga ladies and gentlemen, we are very lucky. Napakaswerte po natin dahil kasama natin ang very important person na ito kahit Sabado sa gitna ng kanyang napaka-busy schedule. He is our #1 MTBM Elite champion, a person who is so proud of his heritage and his mother tongue, of course. A very proud Ilonggo. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome our very own Regional Director, R.D. Alan Farnaso, to share his wisdom and inspire us all.
Magandang umaga sa lahat. Good morning, everyone. I'd like also to greet our friend Dianne and Dr. Rick in itong lecture na ito ay kailangan ng mga magulang natin, lalo pa yung mga palaging nagtatanong how to make learning happen at home. Especially kung yung mga magulang ay hindi rin nakatapos ng kanilang pag-aaral at kulang ng kakayanan para magiging learning facilitators at home. Kaya itong topiko na inquiry-based ay dapat maituturo natin sa mga parents. No? Hindi kailangan magturo ang mga magulang, kailangan natin sila maturuan ng maayos paano magtanong, kung anong itinuro at anong nalalaman nila. In fact, doble ang benepisyo nito kasi in so doing, ang mga parents ay natututo pa sa kanilang mga anak. I am very happy that you're taking MTB-MLE seriously. Hindi ito inferior language. Hindi ito nagpapakita na hindi tayo kasing galing ng ibang mga lahi. Because the development of language takes precedence over understanding, analysis, interpretation. Napakataas ito ng mga level of skill and processing of language na kailangan magsisimula sa isang malinaw na paglinang ng ating sariling wika. We are a country that we have been very fragmented by ideas about what language to be used. And at karamihan, ang ating pang-uunawa dito ay nagkaroon ng influence ng ating previous experiences of how it is to be taught and how it is to learn. Today, we're going to the basic, that the necessity of trying to establish one's competence in his own language is a better way of learning, especially at a very young age, where a child is taught on the manner that he can understand best. Maraming salamat, even if this is a Saturday. I hope, pero alam ko si Dr. Rick, nakasama ko na rin, saka si Pauline at saka si Dianne, you will have a grand time. What I mean is, even if this is a Saturday, this is, I'm sure, a very productive Saturday with Dianne, Rick, and Pauline providing you wisdom, their experiences. Ay nako, itong si Dianne at saka si Rick na ito sa mga Summer Institute for Language, ay marami tayong matutunan dito. And we need to have this learning passed on from where the experts are coming from and to thread this to the level of the learners and the parents. So sa inyong lahat, kasama ng ating Superintendent Hildo G. Mosqueda at ng ating Assistant Superintendent Justado Ablanido, kasama ko dito sa Division Office, si Ma'am Donna Panis at saka si Ma'am Analisa Domingo, ay pinaaabot ko sa inyo ang aking pagbati. Pangalawa, pasasalamat. Maraming salamat. Alam ko na nahaharap tayo sa pinaka challenging na hamon sa edukasyon ngayon. Ngunit nagiging magaan ang lahat dahil nagkakasama-sama tayo. At alam ko na ang inyong ginagawa ay siyang nagpapatunay na anuman kahirap ang hinaharap natin ay mas mapapabuti natin pang lalo dahil sa inyong ginagawa. Pangatlo ay gusto ko rin sanang i-remind kayo na habang ginagawa natin ang ating mga tungkulin, we will continue to ensure that we protect ourselves. Kung saan ang may mga COVID cases, tumataas pa, ngunit we can do our job better if we also take care of our health and safety. So yun lang. Again, nakikita ko sa screen, Pauline, you look very, very pretty. And nakakakaingit ang vital statistics mo, Pauline. Mas maiinggit si Mamo doon na panis sa vital statistics mo. Yeah. Oh my God! I remember that the color violet. That's the color of region. Oh yeah, thank you, Pauline. Thank you. Yan yung regional color ng Region 12, Pauline. And Dr. Rick and Dianne, maraming salamat sa inyo.
Thank you, Sir Alan. But before you will finally say goodbye, can you render us a song in your mother tongue?
Okay. I'd like to offer this song to Pauline, Dr. Rick, and Dianne. Your regional director is Ilonggo. This is a lullaby of a boy, a husband leaving the wife and on traveling. No? So may I share this song to all of you? Dandan so'y bayaan ta ikaw, pauli ako sa payaw, ugaling kong ikaw hidlawon, ang payaw imo lang lantawon, gandang soy kung imo papason, bisan tubig di ka magbalon, o galing kung ikaw uhawon, sa dalan magbubon-bubon, kumbento sa diin ang kura, munisipyo sa diin hustisya, yari sidang soy makima sa pagigugma, panyo mo kag ining panyo ko, gisi-gisi o kay tambihon ko, o galing kung magpasilong, panata ikaw asawa mo ako, dandan so'y bayaan ta ikaw, pauli ako sa payaw, o galing kung ikaw idlawon, ang payaw imo lang lantawon. Wow! Thank you. That's one of the most popular Ilonggo songs. I hope you like it, and I offer that to all of you. Thank you very much. Dianne.
Thank you very much, sir. That was very inspiring.
Amazing, amazing.
Thank you very much, RD. That was indeed a very nostalgic song, no? Sa mga Ilonggo. So, do, nadumduman naman ng ating yung mga kagahapon sinina. Sige. So, Sir Alan, thank you for inspiring us. Thank you for always ensuring that we should protect ourselves first above all. So, sa sinabi ni Sir Alan, competence in the first language is a key to a successful learning. So, importante talaga na magaling ang mga bata. Magaling na sila sa first language para po mas progress pang kanilang learning. So, ngayon, let us continue with Ma'am Dianne Dekker. Sa mga tanong po, please I am really requesting everyone to please take this opportunity to ask questions, lalo na po yung may mga agam-agam pa sa mother tongue-based multilingual education. Throw po tayo ng questions, huwag po tayong mahiya, huwag po tayong magtubiling magtanong kasi po ay sasagutin ng ating direct ng mga experts ang ating mga tanong. So, meron po nag-raise yata ng hand si Ma'am Pauline.
Yes. No, I would want to make actually a comment, or it could also be a question for Dianne, but probably when she starts sharing her screen again.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I share?
Yes, please.
Okay, hold on a second. There we go.
That slide with the faces.
All right. Oops, I just clicked the wrong button. Hold on. There we go. There we go. This one or the one before? This one.
The one before. If it could be done. Because I think this one is really very interesting. Like what you said, it doesn't come by age or say by grade level, but rather really, this is a very good way to think of how to develop all of the languages. And then a while ago, you were sharing also that, as the teachers right now, we weren't really educated using our first languages. So I think this would also be a good guide, thinking about how teachers could also help themselves to develop their own languages. Like, where are you right now, your proficiency? And then you made mention also a while ago about teachers now helping each other building their languages through lesson plans or discussions. So I would really want to thank you for this one. And if you might want to expound on that too.
Sure. Yeah, because if you think about this, this order of language development from oral to written and from L1 to L2 and to L3, some teachers have never been literate in their own mother tongue before MLE. Some were very strongly literate in Tagalog and English, but because they had no opportunity to learn in their L1, then sometimes at the very beginning of starting MTB MLE, they are hesitant to read into their class in their first language because they feel like they sound like kindergartners because they're just learning how to read in their or how to bridge themselves back from their L2 into their L1. But I just want to encourage you that it just takes a bit of practice. Once you learn to read, that's all you need. You're just learning to understand that those marks on the paper actually have meaning, and you're learning to put the meaning there appropriately. So when you can decode a language, then you can learn to read any other language. You may have to learn a new script, like if you're learning Chinese or Japanese or Korean or Hindi or Sanskrit or something like that. But you still have the concept of what reading is. So just give yourself time to develop your own L1 literacy. And don't be afraid. Your students are very kind and gracious, especially if you model what kindness and grace is in the classroom, then they will respond in the same way. So give yourselves time. And that's why I also wanted to stress that idea of teachers collaborating and working together and using their L1 as they collaborate. Don't just, talk in the lingua franca. I don't know what the lingua franca is in Sarangani, but if, for example, it might be Cebuano, don't just talk about the L1 using Cebuano. Use the L1 to talk about it so that you're developing your L1 and you're thinking about how do we represent these academic concepts in the L1. You may not have words like for hypothesis or equals, or even simple words like plus and minus. You may not have words that mean that in the L1. So you just have to decide, what am I going to use? Am I going to use Tagalog words? Am I going to use English words? But I still have to explain those. I still have to talk about those. So you have to think about your own L1, your oral use of L1, your literacy use of L1, as well as your L2s and your L3s. And that's a good point, Pauline, that teachers can use this also to think about developing their own 3 languages and their own L1. Okay.
And we have 2 questions here from our Zoom participants.
Sure.
First, from one of our district supervisors, Ma'am Glenda Morales. She says here, hello po Ma'am Dianne, the pedagogy really is so good since it is encouraged interactive learning. What do you think will be best alternative in delivering instructions with these pedagogies using modular modality? Ayan po, I will repeat the question.
Wait a minute, Mom Evan. Somebody has their mic on. If they could turn their mic off, I'd probably be able to hear you better. Try again. Maybe they turned it off now. Thank you.
Sige. I will repeat the question.
Yeah.
What do you think will be the best alternative in delivering instructions with these pedagogies using modular modality? Nakuha niyo po? Did you get it, Miss Dianne?
Using something modality. I couldn't hear the word before modality.
Yes, she was asking if what do you think will be the best alternative in delivering instructions with these pedagogies using modular modality?
She's Dianne, may I clarify?
Yes, please.
She's talking about modules. Okay, under the new situation, face-to-face is still not allowed, and therefore they have to print modules to give to the parents and also to the children. And what she's asking is, what would be a good way under the new situation where there's no face-to-face and you have to use modules?
That's a very good and very challenging situation. And I'm just going to answer it off the top of my head. So you probably have scholars in your area or teachers or supervisors who have thought through this, and they might have some ideas too. But I would say, first of all, because you are going to use the parents as teachers, you need to support them in what they do with their children and how they help their children as much as you can. So simplify, simplify, simplify. And then when you write up the lesson plan, if you can create activities that the parents can do with the children that might demonstrate the concept that you're trying to get across, and then have them talk about that activity in order to learn the concept that you're trying to get across, that might be the best way to help parents and to help children learn. So create an activity that the parents can do with the kids, then give some guiding questions perhaps that the parents can ask the children to have a discussion with the children over the activity to make the point of whatever it is that they're meant to learn that's in the curriculum. That's one thing, but I would say make sure you simplify everything. You could also send home either short stories that are printed out that the parents can read if they're able to read to the children, or the children might read them to the parents if the children are already reading, and then have some guiding questions to talk about that story, where the story actually explicates the content that you want to get across. So anything that you can do to help the parents do a good job in terms of leading their children to understanding without expecting the parents to be you, because they're not going to be you. Probably they're not going to be comfortable being the teacher, and there might be, you know, a little bit of tension between the students and the parents too. You have to take that into consideration too. So make it as fun and as practical as possible so that they will actually do it. Otherwise, you might end up having situations where they're doing as minimal as they can get by with. Those are just some ideas. I don't know how helpful or practical you find them, but.
Okay. I'd like to inform the audience that we will be taking up materials development using a material. We're going to share with you some short stories in English, Filipino, and this is about the you belong in the water, okay, and how to integrate the learning competencies under MELCs. Okay, so we can use a material integrating many of the competencies in the various subjects at a certain level. But we're going ahead of, I think Pauline will be in a better position. We can ask that question in the latter portion of the series.
Right. So, Ms.
Perfect.
Dianne, we have another question from our one of our education program supervisors, Ma'am Beth Torres. She is an Ilocana from Maitong, Sarangani. So she's saying here, Ma'am Dianne, in the new normal, we give the children in grade 1 modules for them to learn with the help of their parents because there's no face-to-face. How can we be sure that the child has gained the mastery level of cognitive, academic, language proficiency?
Yeah, that's a challenging thing, and it's going to be very hard to do. And the other thing that's going to be very challenging is helping the parents understand how to teach Tagalog well and how to teach English well, because you yourselves want to adjust how you teach those languages, and it's going to be hard to work with the parents to do that. So I think basically what you have to say is we're all in a learning situation. The parents are learning how to do something they've never done before and probably had no intention of doing before. The children are learning how to do things differently. You're learning how to do things differently. So we might have to put that term mastery aside for a while. We might just have to say, you know, we're all growing, we're all developing, we're all learning, and whatever learning happens, we're going to be happy with that. And then when we get back face to face, hopefully, the teacher can make some adjustments and make sure that learning continues. But I think that to expect mastery when you're sending modules home for the parents to do might be a little bit too high of an expectation. Remember, parents are not necessarily trained teachers. They don't have the training and the experience that you have. And so it's going to be challenging for them to implement things. That's why simplify, 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 and utilize activities and utilize discussions between parents and kids.
Thank you for that, Ms. Dianne. So can you answer another 1 or 2 questions from
Maybe.
our participants from the field? All right, 1 question. So I've learned in your talk today that we need to start to develop. This is from Sir Theo Loronelia, one of the teachers in Sarangani, that we need to start to develop the oral literacy of a student and focus on their native language. Now, we have a different native language. The students are Blaan and I am Bisaya. So there's a mismatch of the language of the learners and the teacher. Does it mean that we need to learn their native language as well for us to develop their oral literacy?
Yeah, that is a very challenging but very real question. I understand that. I would say there's a couple of ways you could go about it. One way is you could find volunteers from the community who are willing to come in and support oral L1 development and literacy in L1. Excuse me, but the teacher should always be there when the volunteer is working with the students so that the teacher can observe what the volunteer is doing, make sure that they're on track, and the teacher can also pick up some of the L1. But of course, you're not going to have time to become fluent in the L1 in order to teach it. So you could either do that, or if you're in a situation where you have multiple languages in the classroom, you might choose one dominant language. Maybe it's the lingua franca. And then the teacher has to learn how to allow students to respond to the teacher using the language that's most familiar and most comfortable to them. So say, for example, you've chosen Cebuano to be the medium of instruction because that's the common language of everybody. It's used in the community, and you already have 4 or 5 languages, and so you have to choose one as your medium of instruction. But when the students respond, you can allow them to respond in their L1 if they can't say everything in Cebuano. It's a challenging situation, and I don't have good responses for that. But if you want to do some searching on translanguaging, that's kind of the new thing in mixed classrooms, and you might look up and see what that means. But I understand the problem, and I think initially I would say if all of your students are Blaan speakers and you speak another language, get a volunteer to come in and help you with the oral L1 and the literacy in L1, and then work with the volunteer as well to make sure that your students understand the content that you might be presenting in another language if you don't speak Blaan. But try to learn some Blaan. You're not going to become highly proficient very quickly, but you might. You never know. It just depends. Sorry, not a very, maybe Pauline can address that in the next session too.
All right, so let's give the time again back to Ma'am Dianne to continue with her topic.
Okay, thank you. I do have a lot more to share with you, so I might end up going a little bit more quickly, but I wanted to talk about these 2 components of language that we need to pay attention to in school, in classroom. Jim Cummins was the one who identified these 2 kinds of language that we use. So BICS is basic interpersonal communication skills. That's the everyday language that we use at home and in the community, when we go to our friend's house, when we're at the playground, in all everyday life aspects. That's basic language. At school, we also have CALP, cognitive academic language, that we need to develop proficiency in. Those are terms that we have to understand in order to learn the content of the lessons. And those are terms that we're not going to use in every day. We don't, when we're cooking supper in the kitchen, we don't usually talk about nouns and pronouns and photosynthesis and hypotenuse and all of those other academic terms, but we have to understand those and be able to use those and understand them if we're going to succeed in learning at school. So teachers need to pay attention to both kinds of languages in all of their teaching. So for example, everyday language, BICS, basic interpersonal communication skills, is conversational language at home, on the playground, in the community, easy to understand and easy to respond to orally. School language, academic language needed for school, it's not easy to understand, it's harder. The vocabulary and also the sentence structure needs to be explicitly taught so that children can understand it and then use it. So vocabulary terms, division, dividend, calculate, equals, pronoun, hypothesis, plus, even a simple word like plus, protractor, comma, and subject. And all of these terms probably don't have equivalents in the L1. So teachers have to think about, how are we going to talk about these concepts? We're going to teach using the L1. You use L1 to teach math and science and things like that. But we have to think about how we're going to talk, what words we're going to use. I don't recommend creating words in your L1. That's too confusing, both for you and for them. But you're going to have to think about, how do I describe and teach what division is, and what word am I going to use? Am I going to use division or another word? Okay, why is this important? A lot of teachers have said to me, my child just wants to learn in English. They are not interested in their L1 or Tagalog, and anyway, they watch cartoons every day, at home. And so they have these English terms that they're familiar with and stuff. Watching cartoons and learning some English is great. A lot of kids do this, but it doesn't mean that they can have a whole conversation in English in order to learn the new concept. Remember, we only want one unknown. So the known has to be the language when they're learning new content. If they're learning language, Tagalog or English, you need to use known content first. Down the road, when they're older, in high school or late elementary school, then you can start teaching content and new language together, but not at the beginning. Definitely not in basic education up through grade 3. Even in grade 4, 5, and 6, a teacher has to be pretty skilled to be able to do that. So anyway, if they sound fluent in the second language, they might be fluent in BICS, but then when it comes to the CALP, they don't know, they can't follow the lesson anymore. They don't know what those terms are. So we have to pay attention. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on all the aspects of language and all the languages so that they can understand both the BICS and the CALP as the teacher is teaching. Okay. The more concepts that students already understand in their first language, the easier it will be for them to bridge those concepts and talk about those concepts in Tagalog as they're learning Tagalog and in English as they're learning English. So the more you use L1 to develop conceptual knowledge, the easier it will be for them to use their L2 and L3 to talk about those concepts. And also, when you use the L1, you're developing not just language, but you're developing their ability to think, to express their ideas and their thoughts, not just repeat what they hear, but to think about things that the teacher says, and then to link it with their own experiences, and then to talk about that. And that helps them learn the other languages in school as well. I'm going to skip this one. You can, okay, no, I won't skip it. So the curriculum, in the curriculum, you need to plan for developing strong CALP and using the first language to support that learning. So teachers need to understand the difference between BICS and CALP so they can pay attention to when they're teaching CALP, when they're teaching BICS, and so they can do both well. Research shows that it actually takes learners 5 to 10 years to learn to understand and use second language CALP. And remember, your students are not just learning Tagalog, they're also learning English. So they have an extra heavy load. Bilingual education is 2 languages, the first language of the learner and a second language. But in the Philippines case, we have multilingual education, the first language, Tagalog and English. So that's an even heavier load than what they found in this research, multiple studies of this research. So they're not going to be proficient at using CALP for 5 to 10 years. So by grade 5 or by high school, they might be proficient in using their L2 CALP. But it only takes them about 2 years to sound fluent in those second languages, to be able to use those conversationally. So if you have that in your mind, then you'll understand if this child sounds fluent, but gets confused when you give them a paper to read or when you give them an assignment to do, and there are academic terms in there that they can't follow, then you'll know why. So some basic principles of multilingual education. For every lesson, you need to focus on linking the new content that you're teaching to what the learners already know. That way they can incorporate it into their schemata, their knowledge, and they can use that. But if you don't link it, it's just taught in isolation. They're not going to link it into what they know, and it's not going to stick as well and be used. Another thing for multilingual education principles is treat all your learners with appreciation and respect. Treat all of your students as if they're the next Einstein or the next Bill Gates or the next Bocelli. You know, they're all brilliant. Don't assume that based on their language, based on their home atmosphere, based on their culture, based on the color of their skin, based on anything like that, based on their height or their width or anything like that, that you have the privilege of treating them differently. You don't. You're the teacher. You teach them how to respect others, and they will get that when they are respected. And when they feel respected and valued, that's when they actually invest in their own learning. If they feel disrespected and unvalued, it's very hard for young children to invest in their own learning. continue developing their first language in all areas in the classroom: listening, speaking, reading, writing, academic learning, etc. Focus on building BICS and CALP in all three of their languages. And when you start teaching the second language, do not start teaching the second language by teaching them the alphabet and decoding of that second language. Don't. You're going to have to be creative. You're going to have to find activities where you can develop oral competency in the second language first, so that when you get to the literacy of the second language, they see words that they're already familiar with, that are already part of their oral vocabulary. And that's when they will read with comprehension. And they'll say, oh, I get it. I understand this. It's fun to read. They will enjoy learning how to read. So start with oral development first. And then when you're teaching concepts, use whatever vocabulary is available to you, and then just explain it in the L1. No, even if you have to use Tagalog CALP terms or English CALP terms, just make sure you explain it in the L1 so that they understand it, and then they can apply that understanding to that term that they have to learn. And don't worry about it. Just relax and enjoy the process, because it's not going to destroy them by doing that. Okay. You have all heard about Bloom's taxonomy, and I just want to describe a little bit about what that is and what it looks like in the classroom, just to make sure that we're on the same page and we have the same understanding. So we have different kinds of thinking and different kinds of processing information in our brains. We have what we call surface level thinking. That's where it's very obvious. In my place in California right now, the sun is setting. So this is dusk. This is, evening time. It's very obvious. I can look out and I understand that. But deeper level thinking or higher level thinking is looking at what's obvious and thinking outside the box. What might be, what might happen, or how did that happen? Like if you're in science class and you're talking about how caterpillars turn into butterflies, well, they might just accept that. A caterpillar makes a little cocoon around itself, and then after a while it comes out of the cocoon and it's a butterfly. They might accept that. But going deeper, the child will think, I wonder how that happens. What happens inside the cocoon that makes the caterpillar turn into a butterfly? And that's an opportunity to explore those higher level things, because they have to think beyond what's very obvious, what's right in front of them. Sometimes if you're reading a story, they might be able to, you might ask them very surface level questions like, where did the story happen? And they can tell you because it's written right in the text. Or who's the main character? They can tell you because it's written right in the text. But if you ask them a question like, what do you think will happen next? Then they have to think outside the box, because you're asking them a question that's not right in the text, and you're getting them to think at a higher level. They have to be imaginative and creative. And so that's what Bloom's taxonomy is all about. It's about going beyond the surface level obvious to a deeper level. And if you think about it, when you were teaching in Tagalog and English, you had no choice, really. You had to stay at the surface level because your students' vocabulary was not strong enough for them to become imaginative and creative. But now that you're using the first language, that's the language they use to think in. That's the language that they use to talk in. So you can use that first language to develop that higher level thinking, and they don't have to stay at the surface level. So if we start at the bottom of this pyramid, the bottom is actually the surface level. And as you go up the pyramid, it becomes more complex. So remembering is the first most basic, then understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. And we'll take those apart a little bit in the next. Yeah, okay, so here, remembering is recalling facts and concepts. And then understanding means you're able to explain the idea to someone else. And applying means you can use that information in a brand new situation. They can think about, oh yeah, didn't we learn about that the other day in science? Well, let's apply that here. And then analyzing means you're able to draw connections. Oh, that's like when my mother did this in the kitchen when she couldn't start the stove or the firewood was wet or whatever. Then it's like that there. They're drawing connections between ideas that they're learning. And when they're evaluating, they're saying, this one is better than this one, or this one is not, as productive or something. They have to give a reason for why they're evaluating, what their evaluation is. So they have to justify an opinion or a decision. And when they're creating, they're producing new or original work. So whenever you teach creative writing, which we'll get to a little bit later, they're producing something that's brand new. It's not copying someone else's work. It's a whole new creation. And these are the ways that you teach them to think more deeply, specifically in the classroom. So let's see. Teachers need to plan their lesson objectives so that students learn to think deeply, to think well, to apply the higher levels of Bloom's, and not just to memorize information. I know teachers want to teach toward the test because they know it's going to be on the test, and they know that if their students can do well on the test, then they will be deemed good learners and the teacher will be deemed a good teacher. But really what we want them to do is to be able to learn to think so that when they come to a question on the test that they're not prepared for, they can think through that question, analyze it, and come up with a good answer to that question. They don't have to just rely on what they remember, what they memorized, what they recited for the teacher. It's thinking.